In the earliest age of the Imperium, when the stars themselves seemed newly claimed by human hands, there existed profound and unshaken certainty. It was an era before betrayal had a name, before brother raised blade against brother, before doubt crept into the hearts of demigods. It was the time of the Great Crusade. Across the breadth of the galaxy, the Emperor of mankind advanced at the head of an expanding dominion. He was a distant figure to most, an intellect vast beyond comprehension, a presence that inspired or rather than affection. Few among the countless trillions of humanity ever beheld him. Fewer still could claim to understand him. Yet his will flowed outward through fleets, through armies, through the thunder of compliance and the silence that followed it. The dream was simple in its articulation, immeasurable in its scale. A united humanity, free from ignorance, free from superstition, free from predation of alien empires and the horrors that lurked between the stars. It was not merely conquest. It was reclamation. Worlds lost during Old Night were rediscovered. Fractured civilizations were folded back into a single, ordered design. And among the countless systems that would one day carry weight beyond measure, there was a world near the edge of the Eye of Terror's distant shadow, a harsh planet known as Cadia. In that age, Cadia was not yet the fortress world of legend. It was a frontier, a world of stone plains and ancient ruins, standing sentinel at a threshold humanity scarcely understood. Its skies bore strange lights at night, and its people, descendants of isolated human settlers, lived beneath monoliths whose origins were older than any record they possessed. To the Imperium, Cadia was one of many rediscovered worlds. To the Emperor's strategists, it was a point upon a map, a node of significance measured in calculations and probabilities. To those who walked its surface, it was home. The Great Crusade did not move randomly. It advanced with deliberate purpose. Expeditionary fleets, led by the Emperor's gene-forward sons, the Primarchs, cut paths through hostile territories and fractured realms. The legions of Astartes, clad in ceramite and armed with weapons that split armor and stone alike, brought compliance to human worlds that resisted reunification. Compliance was rarely gentle. Yet in those years, there was a prevailing belief among the warriors of the Imperium that their cause was righteous and necessary. The galaxy was a perilous wilderness. Orc empires raged across entire sectors. Eldar craft worlds drifted in inscrutable silence. Warp storms severed travel lanes without warning. Human civilizations, isolated for millennia, had developed divergent creeds and customs, some benign, others twisted by fear or by darker influences. Against this chaos stood a singular authority. The Emperor's presence at the forefront of the Crusade was both symbol and substance. He was strategist and conqueror, philosopher and warlord. His vision was of a rational imperium, guided not by superstition but by understanding. The imperial truth, as it came to be known, denied gods and denounced mysticism. It proclaimed that humanity would master its destiny through reason and unity. For many, this doctrine was liberating. It replaced fragmented mythologies with a universal purpose. It offered order in place of uncertainty. Yet the galaxy was older than reason. When the Crusade reached the Cadian Gate, the narrow corridor of stable warp routes near the Eye of Terror, it did so with confidence born of unbroken momentum. Victories had accumulated. The Primarchs had been rediscovered one by one, reunited with their legions, and unleashed upon the stars. Each was a warlord without equal, a being sculpted to embody a fragment of the Emperor's own genius. Among them, Horus stood foremost. He was not yet burdened by doubt, nor shadowed by whispers. He was a favored son, commander of vast campaigns, a figure who inspired loyalty with a mere word. His presence during the Crusade's expansion toward the Cadian region was emblematic of the Imperium's strength at its height. Where he led, compliance followed swiftly. And yet, Cadia was unlike many worlds encountered before. Its people bore strange violet eyes, a genetic trait that had persisted across generations. They spoke of ancient watches and of storms that raged beyond the veil of reality. The black pylons that rose from its surface defied immediate explanation. They were relics of a civilization long vanished, their geometry alien, their purpose obscured. The Mechanicum dispatched adepts to study them. Data was recorded. Hypotheses were constructed. But even in that age of confidence, there were phenomena that resisted categorization. The Emperor himself took interest in the region, not publicly, not with proclamation, but with a quiet gravity that marked his most deliberate decisions. The Cadian Gate was more than a passageway. It was a boundary. Beyond it churned a realm of impossible energies, a wound in the fabric of the galaxy known to navigators and astropaths as the Eye of Terror. To most citizens of the Imperium, the Eye was a navigational hazard, a vast warp storm. To those who had glimpsed its depths through sanctioned channels, it was something more profound and more perilous. The Emperor understood this. He had always understood that humanity's greatest threat did not reside solely in Xeno's empires or rebellious colonies. It lay in the immaterial realm, within the warp itself. The Great Crusade was not merely about physical expansion. It was about fortifying humanity against influences that could not be countered by fleets alone. Thus, Cadia's compliance carried significance beyond its mineral wealth or strategic location. It was to become a bulwark, a watchpoint at the edge of a churning abyss. The legion stationed there during the early years encountered resistance, but not in conventional sense. There were cults among the population, secretive groups that venerated forces they could not name. There were ruins that defied demolition. There were nights when the auroras shimmered in unnatural patterns and vox channels filled with static that carried faint, almost voices. These occurrences were suppressed in official reports. Not erased, but contextualized. The imperial truth did not permit superstition. Anomalies were to be studied, not feared. And yet, among the Astartes who stood watch upon the black plains of Cadia, there lingered an awareness that this world occupied a threshold. The Emperor did not linger long in any one system during the Crusade's height. His attention was vast, divided among 1,000 fronts. But when he departed from the Cadian region, the orders he left behind were precise. Fortifications were to be strengthened, monitoring stations established, warp routes catalogued with exceptional care. The unity of the Imperium during this time was genuine. The Primarchs competed, but in brotherhood. The legions bore distinct cultures, yet fought beneath a common banner. The Mechanicum of Mars provided technological might. The Imperial army followed in disciplined waves. Civil administrators rebuilt compliant worlds in the image of Terra's design. It was an age when humanity believed itself unstoppable. On Cadia, construction began in earnest. Bastions rose upon ancient foundations. Training regiments hardened local regiments. The children of that stern world grew beneath skies that flickered with distant warp light, their eyes reflecting violet hues that would one day become synonymous with unyielding resolve. They did not know what they guarded. Few did. The Emperor's grand design was layered, its ultimate purposes revealed only in fragments even to his closest sons. The Webway project had not yet been whispered beyond select circles. The notion that humanity might one day sever its reliance on the warp entirely was too vast for common discourse. But every bastion built to the Cadian Gate, every patrol dispatched along its stable routes, was part of a greater calculus. The Great Crusade continued outward. New Primarchs were rediscovered. New empires were brought to heel. The Imperium's borders expanded in widening arcs. News of triumph traveled faster than news of difficulty. Monuments were raised to commemorate unity. Remembrances recorded deeds in illuminated tomes. In those records, the era seemed unassailable. Yet at the very edge of that expanding light, Cadia stood watch over a darkness that did not recede. It churned. It whispered. It waited. The Emperor's vision was vast enough to encompass centuries, perhaps millennia. But even the most far-seeing architect must contend with forces that do not yield easily to design. The warp could be navigated, channeled, and measured in its tides. It could not be wholly mastered. On quiet nights upon Cadia's plains, when the winds fell still and the pylons cast long shadows beneath alien stars, there was a sense, unspoken, unrecorded, that the world existed in a state of poised anticipation. Not fear, not yet, but awareness. The Great Crusade's fleets would move on. The legions would march to other wars. The Emperor would return to Terra to pursue works of even greater secrecy. And Cadia would remain, vigilant at the galaxy's wound. In that age of legend, before heresy fractured brotherhood and before the Imperium learned the full cost of ambition, there was unity. There was purpose. There was belief in an unbreakable future. And on a stern world of stone and violet-eyed children, beneath a sky haunted by distant storms, humanity placed its first enduring watch against the end of the galaxy. The stars burned steadily above. The fleet sailed outward. And at the threshold of the abyss, Cadia kept its silent vigil, waiting for a destiny not yet written. As the Great Crusade advanced deeper into the uncharted reaches of the galaxy, the Imperium's outward momentum seemed inexhaustible. Expeditionary fleets carved luminous paths through the void, linking reclaimed systems into a widening constellation of compliance. Worlds that had endured centuries of isolation were drawn back into unity, their banners lowered and replaced by the sigil of the Aquila. Yet beyond the spectacle of conquest and the thunder of orbital bombardment, there existed a quieter current, one that flowed beneath every campaign and every decree. It was a current of the Emperor's design. For those who served him directly, the Emperor was not merely a sovereign, but an architect of destiny. His decisions were seldom explained in full and rarely debated. He issued directives with measured certainty, trusting that his sons and his commanders would execute them without hesitation. In this, the Imperium functioned as a living instrument, its vast machinery responding to a single guiding will. Cadia, standing sentinel of the Cadian Gate, had already been marked as a fulcrum within this design. But as years passed and the Crusade pushed ever outward, its importance grew in quiet proportion to the Imperium's expanding borders. The Eye of Terror remained a presence at the periphery, an immense warp anomaly that defied precise measurement. Navigators charted its boundaries with caution, their third eyes discerning tides and eddies within the immaterium that no Auspex array could fully quantify. Astropaths spoke in subdued tones of pressure upon their thoughts when transmissions passed too near its rim. To most within the Imperium, such matters were abstractions. The imperial truth had banished talk of diamonds and spirits, relegating such notions to the category of ignorance. Warp phenomena were described in terms of energy fluctuations and dimensional instability. Language shaped perception, and perception shaped belief. But the Emperor understood that the warp was more than a storm to be endured. In private councils, far from the scrutiny of remembrances and iterators, he spoke to selected primarchs of humanity's vulnerability. The species was psychic by nature, its potential vast but perilous. Uncontrolled, that potential invited catastrophe. Guided, it could become the foundation of a new age. The Great Crusade, then, was not solely about territory. It was about consolidation, gathering humanity beneath a unified doctrine so that its psychic evolution might be directed, rather than exploited. Cadia's proximity to the Eye rendered it both shield and warning. The world's strange pylons, whose geometry resisted easy classification, drew increasing scrutiny from a mechanicum. Explorator teams descended into half-buried chambers beneath their towering forms. Data slate after data slate filled with readings that fluctuated in patterns difficult to interpret. There were indications of energy dispersion, subtle dampening effect upon warp signatures. Such findings were not proclaimed openly. They were transmitted along encrypted channels to Terra and to Mars, where the most trusted adept considered their implications. If the pylons influenced the warp, even in minor measure, then Cadia was more than a fortress. It was a keystone. The legions of start station at the gate adapted to their role with disciplined resolve. Rotations ensured that no single legion bore the burden indefinitely. Companies from several brotherhoods passed through the Cadian theater, each leaving behind fortifications and tactical doctrines refined by experience. To these warriors, Cadia was a post of vigilance. Patrol routes traced stable warp corridors, intercepting hostile vessels that drifted too close to Imperial space. Orc raiders were repelled. Rogue human enclaves were subdued. The work was steady, unglamorous, essential. Among the local population, a culture of endurance deepened. Generations were raised with the understanding that their world guarded something vast and unseen. Military service became not merely obligation, but inheritance. Children learned to field-strip lance rifles before they could fully comprehend the stars above them. The violet hue of their eyes remained a quiet curiosity to off-world observers. Geneticists catalogued it as an inherited trait of no immediate detriment. Few suspected that prolonged exposure to the region's warp-saturated environment had left its subtle imprint upon Cadian bloodlines. The Emperor's presence during this era grew more distant in a physical sense. As the Crusade matured, he entrusted increasing authority to his primarchs. Horus, elevated to the role of War Master, coordinated campaigns across vast distances. His leadership unified the legions with charismatic clarity. The Emperor withdrew to Terra more frequently, his focus turning inward toward projects of immense secrecy. Whispers circulated among senior commanders of subterranean construction beneath the Imperial Palace. Vast chambers were carved. Arcane machinery was installed. The purpose was not publicly declared, yet it aligned with the broader trajectory of the Imperial vision, reducing reliance upon the warp, shielding humanity from its predations. In this context, Cadia's watch took on added gravity. It was not merely guarding imperial space. It was guarding time. Time for the Emperor's greater works to reach fruition. Astropathic choirs stationed at the gate reported fluctuations within the eye that suggested a restless quality. Warp storms swelled and receded in unpredictable rhythms. On rare occasions, silhouettes of vessels, ancient and distorted, were glimpsed at extreme sensor range, drifting at the edge of material reality before dissolving into unreality once more. Such incidents were classified, but they were not ignored. The Imperium's confidence remained intact. Each challenge was met with force sufficient to overwhelm it. Yet beneath that confidence lay a growing awareness among certain circles that the galaxy harbored forces patient beyond human reckoning. On Cadia's plains, new bastions were constructed atop foundations that dated back to civilizations predating humanity's rise. The pylons stood unchanged, indifferent to the marching of armies and the erection of walls around them. At times, during periods of heightened warp activity, subtle vibrations could be felt through the stone beneath one's boots, faint, rhythmic, almost like a distant heartbeat. Tech priests measured these tremors with solemn fascination. If the pylons were stabilizing structures, then they were doing so in silence, and if they were failing, they gave no obvious sign. The legions rotated onward as the crusade pressed deeper into hostile regions far from the gate. Tales of grand conquest reached Cadia through astropathic communiques, entire sectors brought into compliance, Xenos empires shattered, ancient human kingdoms restored to unity. The Imperium appeared ascendant in all directions. Yet Cadia remained fixed, unmoving, its gaze forever turned toward the eye. The Emperor's design was one of layers. On the surface, the crusade expanded humanity's dominion. Beneath that expansion lay preparation, subtle positioning of resources, fortification of key worlds, quiet research into phenomena that could not be banished by decree. He did not share the totality of this design, even with his sons. Perhaps he believed that revelation in stages preserved stability. Perhaps he understood that knowledge itself could become a vulnerability. Whatever his reasoning, the result was an Imperium united in purpose, but not in comprehension. And so the years of the Great Crusade flowed onward. Victories accumulated. Unity hardened into doctrine. Confidence crystallized into assumption. On Cadia, soldiers stood watch beneath skies streaked with unnatural auroras, their armor reflecting the pale glow of distant stars. They did not question their vigil. They did not foresee the scale of trials that future centuries would bring. They knew only that their world guarded a threshold shaped by forces older than the Imperium, a threshold the Emperor himself had deemed worthy of relentless defense. As the fleets of the Great Crusade vanished into the depths of the galaxy and Terra's hidden works advanced behind walls of adamantine, Cadia endured in disciplined silence. The pylons hummed faintly in the darkness. The eye of Terra churned beyond its invisible boundary. And in the stillness between heartbeats, the Emperor's design unfolded, vast, intricate, and incomplete. In the high years of the Great Crusade, when compliance after compliance seemed to affirm the inevitability of imperial destiny, there came a period of relative stillness along the Cadian Gate. It was not peace in the absolute sense, for the Imperium knew little of true peace. Patrols continued. Vox relays carried coded signals across the void. Supply convoys arrived at precise intervals, bearing munitions, machinery, and fresh regiments drawn from distant worlds. Yet compared to the grand offensives raging far beyond the gate, Cadia's theater grew measured, almost contemplative. The eye of Terra remained a constant presence upon the edge of perception. From orbit, it was visible as a vast distortion in the firmament, a region where starlight bent unnaturally and color seemed subtly wrong. To navigators, it was a turbulent sea. To psychers, it was pressure, a distant weight upon the mind. To the Cadians, it was simply there. Generations had grown accustomed to its existence. Children born beneath its shadow learned to read the subtle variations in the sky's luminance as instinctively as others might read the weather. The violet hue in their eyes deepened over time, a quiet mark of their adaptation to an environment saturated with immaterial resonance. The Imperium took note of these adaptations without alarm. The Emperor's genetic sciences had long demonstrated that humanity could endure in extremes. So long as mutation did not diverge into instability, it was catalogued and tolerated. Beneath the surface of Cadia, however, the ancient pylon continued to defy complete understanding. Mechanicum expeditions expanded their investigations into deeper strata. Subterranean vaults were uncovered, corridors of impossible angles that led to chambers lined with materials resistant to conventional analysis. The pylons above ground were not isolated constructs. They were part of a vast, interconnected network. Energy readings suggested a subtle field effect, one that fluctuated in response to warp disturbances emanating from the eye. When warp storms intensified, the pylon's activity increased in tandem, emitting faint oscillations detectable only by the most sensitive instruments. To some among the Mechanicum's inner circles, a hypothesis formed. The pylons were not relics of worship or ornamentation. They were regulators. If this was true, then Cadia was not merely guarding the gate by force of arms. It was participating in its containment through ancient design. Such conclusions were transmitted to Terra under layers of encryption. Whether the Emperor had foreseen this function, or whether confirmed suspicions he already held, was not recorded in any accessible archive. Yet orders soon followed. The pylons were to be preserved at all costs. No dismantling, no intrusive experimentation that might compromise their integrity. Thus Cadia's defensive posture shifted subtly. Fortifications were rue-lined to incorporate the pylons within layered bastions. Artillery emplacements were positioned to ensure overlapping fields of fire around each monolith. The world became a lattice of defense anchored to structures older than humanity's memory. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Great Crusade approached its zenith. Horus, War Master and favored son, commanded vast campaigns in the Emperor's stead. His reputation grew with each victory. Where he led, legions fought with renewed fervor. He was seen as the embodiment of imperial strength, charismatic, decisive, unwavering. Reports from distant fronts spoke of Primarchs reunited with their legions, of fractured realms brought swiftly to compliance. The Imperium's map expanded in sweeping arcs. It seemed, to many, that the galaxy itself was yielding. If the pylons were part of a galaxy-spanning array, then their purpose exceeded local containment. They might represent remnants of an ancient war fought on a scale humanity could scarcely imagine. Such conclusions were not widely disseminated. Instead, Terra issued reinforced directives. Cadia's defenses were to be expanded further. Fleet presence increased incrementally. Additional Astartes detachments rotated through the gate under pretext of training in extreme warp-adjacent conditions. The world became a crucible. It tested discipline. It tested morale. It tested the endurance of those stationed upon it. And still, the eye churned. Occasionally, phenomena manifested along its boundary that defied conventional metrics. Vox arrays recorded harmonic distortions, tones that persisted below audible thresholds. Auspex scans detected fleeting mass signatures that vanished before interception could occur. At times, the auroras above Cadia intensified to near-blinding brilliance, casting violet light across fortress walls. During such episodes, the pylon's emissions rose sharply. The correlation was undeniable. Cadia was not merely guarding against incursion. It was restraining something. This awareness did not breed panic. Rather, it deepened resolve. To hold Cadia was to hold a barrier whose function predated humanity itself. The symbolism resonated even within the strictures of the imperial truth. Here was tangible evidence that the galaxy's past had been shaped by forces immense and perilous. The Great Crusade, in its outward sweep, had encountered many relics of forgotten epochs, but none possessed the immediate, continuous relevance of the Cadian pylons. Far across the stars, campaigns intensified. Reports reached the gate of legions engaging foes of unprecedented ferocity. Compliance required greater expenditure of resources. Casualty lists lengthened. Though victory remained the Imperium's hallmark, its cost grew heavier. On Cadia, this translated into an unspoken understanding. If ever the Imperium faltered elsewhere, the gate would feel the consequence first. The War Master's communiques continued to project confidence. Unity, he declared, was humanity's shield. The Emperor's vision guided all endeavors. The Crusade's end, complete reunification, remained within reach. Yet beneath such declarations, currents shifted. Astropathic anomalies increased in frequency. Messages occasionally arrived fragmented, as though passing through turbulence beyond May-warp instability. Interpretations varied. Some attributed it to natural fluctuation. Others suspected deeper agitation within the immaterium. Cadia's commanders did not speculate openly. They fortified. They drilled. They watched. Years accumulated. Veterans aged into instructors. Children became soldiers. The violet gaze of Cadia's population sharpened with generational continuity. The world's identity crystallized around vigilance so absolute that it bordered on ritual. And still, no decisive assault emerged from the eye. Only pressure. Only the steady reminder of proximity. Within the imperial palace, unseen by those who stood watch at the gate, the emperor's secret labors approached critical junctures. The webway tunnels carved beneath Terra neared completion in segments. Arcane machinery thrummed in hidden vaults. A path independent of the warp seemed, perhaps, within reach. If achieved, it would redefine the Imperium's vulnerability. If delayed, consequences might follow. Cadia did not know these details. It knew only its duty. To stand, to endure, to buy time. The weight of vigil was not measured in days or battles, but in constancy, in the refusal to yield even a single corridor through which the eye's turbulence might spill unopposed. As the era of legend advanced toward its unseen precipice, Cadia remained steadfast beneath skies alive with unnatural light. The pylons hummed in low resonance. The fleets held their stations. And in the measured silence between warp surges, the world stood immovable, bearing the quiet knowledge that when the galaxy's great design was tested, it would be here, at this threshold, that the first true strain would be felt. In the latter years of the Great Crusade zenith, when imperial banners stretched across a greater expanse than at any previous point in human history, a subtle transformation began to manifest along the Cadian Gate. It was not a single event. It was a pattern. Astropathic choirs stationed within Cadia's deepest sanctums reported disturbances that did not conform to prior warp models. Where once fluctuations resembled storms, violent yet transient, there now emerged sequences of harmonic repetition. Pulses, echoes, reverberations that suggested not random turbulence, but response. The immaterium, it seemed, was reacting. Reports were transmitted to Terra and to the War Master's command. Interpretations differed. Some believed the intensification to be a natural consequence of increased warp traffic, as the Crusade's fleets moved in greater numbers across established corridors. Others proposed that the eye itself underwent cyclical agitation, independent of imperial action. Yet among those who had served longest at the gate, there arose an unspoken unease. The pylon's activity increased in direct correspondence with these echoes. Auspex readings indicated expanded field projections, subtle but measurable, extending outward from each monolith. When warp resonance intensified, the pylons answered in kind, emitting low-frequency waves that momentarily dampened psychic pressure across the surrounding region. Cadia was not passive. It was engaged in a silent dialogue with the storm. This ruralization altered defensive doctrine once more. Fleet deployments adjusted to protect key pylon clusters. Ground forces were tasked not only with perimeter defense, but with maintaining structural integrity of the ancient network. Contingency plans were drafted for scenarios in which localized pylon failure might occur. For the first time, Imperial projections began to consider the possibility that the gate's stability was not guaranteed. Meanwhile, far beyond Cadia's orbit, the Great Crusade continued to unfold with grandeur and strain intertwined. The War Master's authority solidified further. Entire expeditionary fleets operated under his centralized command, their movements coordinated with increasing autonomy from Terra. The Emperor's silence deepened. To many, this was interpreted as trust. The Crusade had matured, his sons were proven. Yet distance, even when born of necessity, carries consequence. The Primax, once united primarily by the Emperor's immediate presence, now found themselves navigating ambition and ideology with greater independence. Such tensions had not yet erupted into open fracture, but the atmosphere of inevitability that once surrounded the Crusade's progress began to thin. On Cadia, the echoes grew clearer. Astropaths described moments when the warp felt crowded, as though currents were thick with unseen forms pressing against the membrane of real space. Their visions, though controlled and disciplined, occasionally brushed against imagery they struggled to articulate, vast geometries of shifting light, silhouettes without stable dimension, vast presences that observed without revealing themselves. These impressions were suppressed in official summaries. The imperial truth demanded rational framing. Yet the individuals who experienced them carried the memory in silence. The eye's periphery brightened during certain cycles, casting crimson and violet radiance across Cadia's nights. Shadows stretched longer than physics would dictate. Auspex arrays captured anomalies at extreme range, fleeting signatures that vanish upon direct scrutiny. And still, no full incursion emerged. The restraint was almost deliberate. In response, Terra issued additional reinforcements. Elements of multiple legions rotated once more through the gate, bringing with them perspectives shaped by campaigns in distant, hostile sectors. They found Cadia unchanged in its severity, its discipline refined to near ritual precision. The Cadian soldiery, by now hardened across generations, had internalized a singular philosophy: the line must hold, regardless of cost. Their training reflected this absolute. Simulated breach scenarios were conducted in fortress corridors designed to mirror projected warp-spawned assault patterns. Artillery crews drilled to sustain fire through electromagnetic interference. Void ship captains rehearsed coordinated blockade maneuvers intended to seal the gate within overlapping fields of destruction, all of it in preparation for an enemy not yet fully revealed. The Mechanicum's most senior Magi reached a guarded conclusion regarding the pylons. The structures were likely remnants of an ancient species whose war against the warp had reshaped entire regions of space. Their function appeared to impose order upon immaterial flux, stabilizing, suppressing, perhaps even nullifying certain expressions of warp energy. If so, then Cadia's existence was not coincidence. It was inheritance. The Imperium had stumbled upon a bastion forged in forgotten epochs and made it its own. Yet such inheritance came with burden. As warp echoes intensified, there were moments when the pylon's harmonics wavered. Minute deviations, lasting only seconds, registered across monitoring arrays. In those seconds, psychic pressure upon Cadia's surface spiked measurably. Astropaths described sensations akin to standing before an immense door that shuddered against its hinges. Then the pylon stabilized. Then the pressure receded. The pattern repeated with growing frequency. In the wider Imperium, murmurs of strain continued to circulate. Campaigns encountered resistance fiercer than expected. Compliance required harsher measures. The philosophical underpinnings of the imperial truth met subtle resistance among populations long steeped in divergent beliefs. Unity persisted, but it demanded increasing exertion. At the Cadian Gate, commanders began to perceive their vigil not merely as regional defense, but as central pillar. Should the wider Imperium falter, should fractures widen elsewhere, the gate would not merely be tested, it would be targeted. The eye's echo suggested awareness. Not consciousness in any human sense, but reaction, as though the immaterium sensed consolidation in the material realm and pressed outward in answer. Cadia's bastion stood ready. Fleet formations adjusted in incremental patterns to anticipate vector shifts. Deep space augers were extended further into the periphery despite the risk of interference. Every measurable variable was scrutinized. And still, beneath all preparation, there lingered a profound quiet. The calm before revelation. The Great Crusade had forged an imperium of unmatched scale. The Emperor's design advanced toward culmination within hidden vaults on Terra. The War Master's campaign stretched across distant sectors. Humanity believed itself ascendant. Yet at the gate, in the measured pulse of ancient pylons and in the gathering resonance of warp echoes, there existed a reminder that the galaxy did not yield entirely to ambition. Some forces endured beyond conquest. Some thresholds tested not strength alone, but endurance across centuries. As Chapter 5 closes, Cadia stands beneath a sky alive with distant distortion. The pylons hum in steady counterpoint to the eye's rising murmur. Fleets hold formation in disciplined silence. Soldiers maintain their vigil without question. The immaterium stays. The Imperium prepares. And at the edge of the galaxy's wound, the echoes grow louder, though the storm itself is not yet broken. There are moments in history when tension ceases to be theoretical. For decades along the Cadian Gate, the Imperium had observed fluctuations, anomalies, and echoes within the warp. Patterns had been recorded, correlations established. The pylons had answered each surge with measured resistance. The eye of Terra had pulsed and receded in vast, inscrutable rhythms. But then came the first true tremor. It began not with invasion, nor with fleets emerging in fire, but with silence. Astropathic choirs reported a sudden stillness within the immaterium. The usual background turbulence, ever present, ever shifting, flattened into an unnatural calm. Navigators traveling along established warp routes near the gate described conditions that were paradoxically smooth, as though the sea had withdrawn before a storm. On Cadia, Auspex arrays registered a temporary decrease in warp interference. Then the pylons responded. Across the surface of the world, their emissions surged in unison, harmonic frequencies aligning in patterns not previously observed. Energy readings spiked beyond established baselines. Deep beneath the crust, ancient conduit vibrated with intensity that resonated through bedrock and fortress alike. The ground trembled. It was not a catastrophic quake, but a sustained vibration, steady, purposeful. Within orbital command stations, fleet captains adjusted defensive formations without awaiting formal instruction. Void shields were raised to maximum capacity. Weapons systems primed. Communication channels opened across all defense layers. Still, no enemy appeared. Instead, the eye brightened. From orbit, observers witnessed a subtle expansion along its periphery, a swelling distortion, like a wound widening under pressure. Colors deepened into violent hues of crimson and black. Lightning arced within its depths, illuminating silhouettes that vanished before confirmation. The silence in the warp ended. It shattered. Astropathic choirs cried out in synchronized distress as a surge of psychic pressure rolled outward from the eye, striking Cadia's defenses like a tidal wave of thought and emotion. The sensation was described later in measured terms, an extreme warp flare, a dimensional stress event. But in that moment, it felt like impact. The pylons answered. Their harmonic fields intensified to unprecedented levels. Monolithic structures that had stood dormant for millennia now blazed with inner luminescence. Invisible barriers thickened around the gate, distorting the incoming surge and dispersing it across control vectors. On Cadia's surface, the auroras ignited in brilliant arcs of violet and white, casting the fortress world in stark illumination. Vox systems crackled with interference. Power grids fluctuated under the strain. And then, emergence. Not a full invasion fleet, but fragments. Warp-torn vessels, their hulls twisted by prolonged exposure to the immaterium, spilled from periphery of the eye. They appeared without formation, without coordination, derelicts animated by forces that defied classification. Imperial fleet elements responded with disciplined precision. Macro-cannon batteries opened fire. Lances pierced distorted hulls. Boarding torpedoes struck with calculated fury. What emerged was not a conventional foe, but entities and constructs warped beyond recognition, echoes of once human crews fused with alien geometries. The engagements were brutal and brief. Within hours, the immediate incursion was neutralized. Yet the significance lay not in its scale, but in its nature. For the first time, the eye had pressed outward in concert with pylon destabilization. The ancient network had held, but only narrowly. Post-engagement analysis revealed that during the peak of the surge, harmonic alignment across several pylons had wavered by fractional degrees. Microfractures appeared in subsurface conduits previously believed indestructible. The system had endured, but its margin for error was not infinite. Cadia's commanders understood the implication. The eye was testing the boundary, whether by instinctive warp turbulence or by some deeper, malignant intent. Pressure had been applied with unprecedented coherence. Across the Imperium, word of the event traveled in measured tones. Official communiques described it as a contained warp anomaly, successfully repelled by Imperial vigilance. The narrative emphasized readiness, unity, and the continued security of the gate. Yet among senior strategists and Mechanicum archmagos, concern deepened. If such surges increase in magnitude, the pylon capacity might be exceeded. On Terra, where the Emperor labored in secrecy beneath the palace, the timing of the tremor was noted with grave attention. His greater works required stability, time unbroken by catastrophe. The Webway project, though nearing critical phases, remained incomplete. Cadia's endurance was therefore not symbolic. It was essential. In the aftermath, the fortress world intensified its preparations. Damaged pylons were reinforced with carefully integrated support structures designed not to interfere with their unknown mechanisms. Additional fleet elements were stationed permanently within rapid response range. Cadian regiments expanded their training to include psychic resilience protocols developed in cooperation with sanctioned psychers. The population responded not with fear, but with sharpened resolve. They had felt the tremor. They had seen the sky ignite. They had witnessed the eye strain against its confines. And they had held. Generational memory crystallized around this moment. Stories were not embellished, nor dramatized. They were recorded plainly, the day the storm tested the gate and found resistance. Yet beneath the surface of triumph lay an undeniable truth. The test had occurred, which meant the threshold was no longer theoretical. As the galaxy continued its vast rotation and the Great Crusade pressed on toward distant conquests, Cadia entered a new phase of vigilance, one defined not by observation alone, but by experience. The eye had pushed, the pylons had answered, and for a measured, precarious moment, the boundary between realms had trembled. Now, in the quiet that followed, the fortress world stood beneath skies returned to their familiar, unnatural glow. Repair crews worked in disciplined silence. Fleet captains recalibrated formation patterns. Astropaths recovered within shielded sanctums, their minds scarred yet steady. The storm had not broken fully, but it had announced itself. And Cadia, steadfast at the edge of the galaxy's wound, understood that the age of simple vigilance had ended. From this point forward, the gate would not merely be watched. It would be contested. After the first true tremor, Cadia changed. The transformation was not dramatic to an outside observer. Fortress walls still stood in layered tiers across the plains. Orbital defense platforms still traced their silent arcs above the atmosphere. Regiments still marched in disciplined formation beneath skies lit by distant distortion. Yet beneath the visible constancy, something fundamental had shifted. The gate was no longer an abstraction. It had answered pressure. It had strained. And it had endured. From that point onward, vigilance matured into doctrine not merely of readiness, but of inevitability. The Cadians no longer asked whether the eye would test them again. They prepared for when, in orbit, the Imperial Navy restructured its defensive grid into permanent bastion formations. Capital ships were assigned extended deployments measured not in months, but in years. Patrol patterns were tightened. Long-range auger arrays were recalibrated to detect even the faintest ripple emanating from the eye's periphery. On the surface, fortress construction accelerated with renewed purpose. Bastions were no longer placed solely according to terrain advantage. They were aligned to reinforce the pylon network, forming interlocking shields around each monolithic structure. Artillery placements were triangulated not only for external assault, but for containment scenarios should warp manifestations breach too near a pylon cluster. The ancient structures themselves remained inscrutable. Their harmonic output stabilized after the tremor, but subtle variations persisted. Mechanicum adepts noted that the pylons now operated at a marginally elevated baseline, as though aware of heightened demand. Whether this represented adaptation or strain could not be conclusively determined. The distinction, perhaps, no longer mattered. Cadia's role had crystallized into a singular truth. It was a line that must not break. Beyond the gate, the Great Crusade continued to burn across the stars. Victory still arrived through astropathic channels, though increasingly accompanied by reports of stubborn resistance and escalating cost. The War Master's campaigns required coordination across unprecedented distances. Supply lines stretched thin. Communication delays grew more pronounced. Unity remained intact, yet it demanded greater exertion to maintain. Within this broader context, the tremor at Cadia assumed quiet strategic significance. It was discussed in high councils as an anomaly contained, a stress event successfully mitigated. But those who studied long patterns understood that such events seldom occurred in isolation. Pressure applied once would be applied again. On Cadia's training fields, doctrine evolved accordingly. Regiments drilled not only for conventional warfare, but for protracted siege under warp interference. Units practiced fighting in environments where gravity fluctuated or visual perception distorted. Sanctioned psychers were embedded more closely with command structures, their discipline honed to detect psychic anomalies before they manifested physically. The Cadian mindset hardened. Children raised after the tremor grew with stories not of hypothetical threat, but of lived experience. They were taught that the sky itself could rebel, that reality might shudder without warning, and that steadfastness was the only acceptable response. This cultural transformation occurred without ceremony. It simply became. Meanwhile, subtle changes unfolded within the immaterium. Astropaths described currents that felt more purposeful, less chaotic. Where once the warp's turbulence had seemed indifferent, now there were moments when it felt attentive, as though aware of resistance and calculating response. Such impressions could not be quantified. They remained personal, filtered through disciplined minds trained to resist hysteria. Yet patterns emerged across independent reports, suggesting coherence. The eye was not dormant. It was observing. In response, Terra's directives grew more precise. Reinforcement convoys arrived bearing specialized materials designed to enhance pylon-adjacent fortifications. Certain mechanicum constructs, rarely deployed beyond Mars itself, were stationed permanently at the gate. Their presence indicated recognition that Cadia was not peripheral, it was central. The Emperor's greater labors beneath the palace approached critical thresholds. Though concealed from nearly all, their timeline intersected with Cadia's endurance. Each year the gate held firm allowed progress elsewhere to continue uninterrupted. Thus Cadia's vigil was not merely defensive, it was preservative. And still, the galaxy beyond roiled with ambition and strain. The Primarchs, each brilliant and formidable, governed vast theaters with increasing autonomy. Philosophical differences, once softened by the Emperor's immediate presence, now sharpened in subtle ways. None yet foresaw the scale of division that history would record, but the atmosphere of unquestioned certainty had begun to thin. Cadia felt these distant tremors as well. Astropathic transmissions carried undertones difficult to define, moments of tension in phrasing, in timing, in emphasis. Veteran officers noted them, filed them away, and returned to their preparations. Whatever fractures might form elsewhere, the gate's duty remained unchanged. Another surge came months after the first tremor, smaller yet more focused. Warp lightning arced along the eye's boundary. A single vessel emerged, vast, ancient, and grotesquely altered. It did not maneuver with tactical precision. It drifted, as though propelled by currents unseen. Fleet elements engaged immediately. Lance batteries tore into its hull. Boarding teams encountered resistance unlike prior incursions, entities that moved as though animated by thought rather than muscle, dissolving into particulate shadow when struck. The engagement ended in Imperial victory. But analysis revealed that the vessel had emerged precisely along a vector of temporary harmonic weakness between two pylons. It had not been random. The eye, or the forces within it, were probing. Cadia responded by sealing that vector with additional fortifications and recalibrated field projections. The pylon's harmonics were adjusted under mechanicum supervision, their resonance patterns refined to eliminate the discovered vulnerability. The line held, yet with each engagement, the realization deepened. This was no longer a matter of waiting for an unpredictable storm. It was a contest of pressure and resistance, and contests escalate. As Chapter 7 draws toward its close, Cadia stands beneath a sky both familiar and charged with implication. The pylons hum in steady, vigilant resonance. Fleet formations remain locked in patient orbit. Soldiers walk their patrol routes with measured steps, eyes reflecting violet light from auroral arcs. Far across the galaxy, destinies converge in scene. Hey, at the gate, convergence takes a simpler form. Hold, endure, buy time. For as long as the line remains unbroken, the Imperium breathes. And so Cadia waits, not in ignorance, not in complacency, but in disciplined awareness that the next tremor will come. When it does, the fortress world will answer. As the years unfolded following the first tremors at the gate, a deeper awareness settled over Cadia, not of fear, nor of doubt, but of isolation. The Imperium still stood vast and unbroken. The Great Crusade continued its relentless expansion. Compliance fleets pushed into distant reaches where humanity's banners had never flown. Reports of triumph still arrived through astropathic relays, sealed in the formal cadence of imperial proclamation. Yet something fundamental had changed. The Emperor no longer walked among his legions. His physical absence, once temporary and strategic, became enduring. The focus of his will had turned inward, toward terror, toward work so monumental and so secret that even the Primarchs were not entrusted with their full scope. The War Master bore the weight of command across the Crusade's expanse, coordinating fleets and legions in the Emperor's stead. To most within the Imperium, this transition signified maturity. The Crusade had grown beyond the need for singular oversight in every campaign. Trust flowed downward through the chain of command. The machine of conquest operated with formidable efficiency. But on Cadia, beneath the constant presence of the eye, the Emperor's silence fell heavier. It was not that orders ceased. Directives still arrived from Terra, precise and unambiguous. Reinforcements were dispatched. Supplies flowed. The gate remained a priority within strategic calculations. Yet the sense of personal guardianship, of the Emperor's direct gaze upon the threshold, had diminished. The pylons continued their ceaseless resonance. Mechanicum analyses grew more intricate, suggesting that the network's activity now displayed anticipatory qualities. Micro-adjustments in harmonic output occurred moments before detectable warp fluctuations, as though the structure sensed shifts in immaterial pressure before imperial instruments could register them. This observation unsettled even the most disciplined adepts. If the pylons were capable of such response, then their originators had possessed knowledge of the warp far exceeding contemporary understanding. The network was not reactive alone. It was predictive. Cadia, therefore, stood upon the remnants of an ancient war's logic. In orbit, fleet captains reviewed tactical simulations with increasing realism. No longer did projections assume isolated incursions. They began to model sustained assault, waves of warp-driven emergence coordinated across multiple vectors. Supply depots were expanded. Ammunition reserves multiplied. Secondary command centers were established beneath the planet's crust, shielded from orbital devastation. The Cadian regiments adapted accordingly. Training emphasized resilience under prolonged psychic stress. Units practiced maintaining formation amid simulated sensory distortion. Officers drilled rapid response containment procedures in the event of localized reality breaches. Chaplains, though careful to adhere to the imperial truth's rational doctrine, began to incorporate language emphasizing moral endurance, fortitude not only of body, but of mind. The eye responded with unsettling patience. Its surges became less frequent, yet more deliberate. Warp flares no longer erupted chaotically. They formed patterns, almost symmetrical in distribution. Astropaths described moments when the immaterium felt organized, its current aligned in convergent streams pressing toward the gate. Such descriptions were archived with caution. Across the galaxy, tensions among the Primarchs subtly intensified. Differences in philosophy, once masked by unified purpose, began to sharpen in the absence of the Emperor's direct mediation. Some advocated rapid compliance at any cost. Others favored integration and reform. None openly defied the Emperor's vision, but interpretations diverged. These distant strains resonated faintly at Cadia, carried in the tone of communiques and the cadence of strategic updates. Veteran commanders sensed that unity, though intact, required increasing effort to sustain. The gate, however, permitted no distraction. Another surge came, not as violent as the first tremor, but more concentrated. Warp energy coalesced along a narrow corridor, striking the pylon network with focused intensity. For a span measured in heartbeats, harmonic output across 3 monolith clusters faltered simultaneously. On Cadia's surface, gravity fluctuated. Shadows elongated unnaturally. A fortress bastion reported brief manifestation of indistinct forms along its perimeter, silhouettes that dissolved when engaged with disciplined fire. The pylons stabilized. The surge dissipated. But analysis confirmed what many had begun to suspect. The pressure was no longer exploratory. It was strategic. The forces within the eye were learning. This realization carried profound implication. It suggested intention, adaptation in response to resistance. The contest at the gate was evolving beyond random turbulence into measured opposition. Terra's response was immediate. Additional Mechanicum specialists arrived, accompanied by arcane devices designed to reinforce pylon harmonics without interfering with their unknown architecture. A permanent Astartes presence was established at key nodes, their role not merely defensive but investigative, observing, recording, adapting in parallel. And still, the Emperor remained silent. His labors beneath the palace consumed his focus. The webway passages extended incrementally, each segment a potential liberation from reliance upon the warp's treachery. Time remained the most precious resource. Cadia's endurance preserved that time. The fortress world understood this instinctively, even without access to the Emperor's hidden design. They did not need to know the details to grasp the principle. Their vigil mattered beyond immediate survival. As Chapter 8 draws toward its close, Cadia stands in a state of sharpened awareness. The sky above churns with restrained violence. The pylons emit steady, luminous pulses against the darkness. Fleets hold their formation in disciplined arcs, their hulls reflecting auroral light. Far away, destiny gathers in ways none yet fully perceive. Here, beneath the Emperor's silence, the line remains firm, but the immaterium presses closer. and the contest at the gate deepens with every measured breath of the galaxy. There are thresholds in history that cannot be seen in the moment of crossing. Cadia, steadfast at the edge of the Cadian Gate, did not mark a date upon which its vigil transformed from preparation to prelude. No proclamation announced that the galaxy had begun to tilt toward fracture. No single astropathic transmission declared that unity, once unquestioned, now stood upon uncertain ground. Yet the shadow was gathering. The eye of terror no longer surged in isolated tremors. Its disturbances grew layered, overlapping in complex patterns that suggested coordination beyond instinct. Warp currents converged with measured regularity, pressing against the pylon network along calculated vectors. Each surge tested a different seam. Each withdrawal left behind a residue of psychic strain that lingered in the minds of those sensitive enough to perceive it. The pylons endured, but endurance required effort. Mechanicum overseers recorded incremental increases in baseline harmonic output. Where once the monoliths had rested in near dormancy between warp events, they now maintained a steady resonance, as though bracing continuously against pressure. Microfractures detected after earlier tremors were sealed with reinforcement matrices, yet new stress lines appeared in subterranean conduits. The ancient network was not failing, but it was working. On Cadia's surface, the culture of vigilance matured into something austere and absolute. Civilians and soldiers alike understood that their world existed for a singular purpose. Agriculture, industry, education, all were aligned toward sustaining defense. Even recreation carried undertones of discipline, reinforcing unity and resilience. Children were taught the history of the gate not as legend, but as obligation. Above them, the Imperial Navy maintained its layered blockade with increasing density. Patrol fleets rotated less frequently. Capital ships anchored in high orbit for extended deployments, their crews adapting to a life defined by watchfulness rather than campaign glory. Officers studied warp fluctuation data with scholarly intensity, seeking predictive patterns in the eye's agitation. Some patterns emerged. Surges began to coincide with distant reports of unrest within the Imperium. When compliance efforts in far sectors met unexpected resistance, warp turbulence near the gate often intensified. When astropathic networks across the Crusade experienced brief, unexplained interference, the eye responded with subtle brightening along its rim. Correlation did not prove causation, but the timing was difficult to ignore. Across the wider Imperium, strains among the Primarchs deepened in ways not yet visible to the rank and file. Strategic disagreements multiplied. Philosophical interpretations of the Emperor's vision diverged with increasing clarity. None spoke openly of division, yet the cohesion that once flowed effortlessly now required conscious reinforcement. Horus, War Master and commander of the Crusade's vast machinery, bore the weight of these tensions. His communiques to the gate retained measured confidence, yet even in their formal precision, seasoned commanders detected a shift in tone, a gravity not present in earlier years. Cadia did not speculate. It fortified. Another focus incursion struck without warning. Warp energy condensed along 3 separate vectors simultaneously, pushing against pylon clusters separated by continental distances. For a span of minutes that felt immeasurable, the sky above Cadia fractured into arcs of incandescent distortion. From the eye emerged vessels unlike those encountered before, sleeker, more cohesive in structure, bearing markings that defied conventional classification. They maneuvered with purpose, coordinating their approach toward identified harmonic weak points. The Imperial Navy responded with disciplined fury. Macro-cannon salvos converged. Lance batteries burned through void. Astart strike craft intercepted boarding attempts before they could reach orbital platforms. Yet this engagement differed from prior skirmishes. The hostile vessels adapted mid-conflict, altering vectors to exploit momentary fluctuations in pylon resonance. They were not drifting remnants. They were probing with intent. The pylons surge and counterpoint, their luminescence visible even through the planet's atmosphere. Harmonic frequencies synchronized across the network, creating a stabilizing field that distorted warp energy at the threshold. Reality flexed, but did not tear. After hours of brutal exchange, the incursion collapsed. Surviving hostile craft were annihilated or drawn back into the eye's churning depths. Cadia had held, but the cost was measurable. 2 orbital platforms lay in ruin, a cruiser's hull bore scars that would never fully repair. Thousands of lives were lost in void and on fortress walls. Beneath the surface, One pylon cluster required emergency stabilization to prevent cascading harmonic failure. For the first time, projections acknowledged that sustained assault might overwhelm even this ancient defense. The implications settled like ash across command chambers. If the Eye intensified its efforts in coordination with unrest elsewhere in the Imperium, the Gate could become the fulcrum upon which fate pivoted. Terror's silence persisted. The Emperor's hidden labors advanced toward culmination, yet no public acknowledgement of the Gate's escalating trials emerged. To many, this silence signified confidence. To others, it suggested preoccupation with matters too critical to divert attention. Cadia interpreted it simply. The line must hold without expectation of rescue. As months passed following the coordinated incursion, the Eye's activity subsided into a watchful quiet. No major surges erupted. No vessels breached the periphery. The pylon's baseline resonance gradually decreased, though it never returned to the dormancy of earlier years. The stillness felt deliberate. Astropaths described the sensation of being observed, not by individual minds, but by a vast, diffuse awareness pressing against the boundary of perception. Dreams among the population grew more vivid, tinged with abstract imagery of fracture and flame. Sanctioned psychers increased their meditative disciplines, shielding themselves against intrusive impressions. The shadow was no longer distant. It lingered at the threshold. And yet, amid this gathering tension, Cadia's resolve did not waver. Regiments replenished their ranks. Fleet formations tightened. Mechanicum adept refined harmonic calibration algorithms to minimize response latency. Each setback was absorbed into doctrine. Each scar became instruction. Far beyond the Gate, events moved toward a convergence few yet understood. But here, at the edge of the galaxy's wound, the fortress world stood in unwavering defiance. The pylons hummed with restrained power. The Eye churned with patient intensity. And in the measured silence between surges, Cadia prepared, not for a single battle, but for an era in which the line itself would define the fate of the Imperium. The shadow gathered, and the Gate endured. Cadia did not sleep. Even when the orbital docks dimmed their lights and the training fields fell quiet beneath the ash-colored sky, the world remained awake. Beneath its crust, reactors thrummed in layered harmony. Along its bastions, sentries stood in disciplined stillness. In orbit, defense platforms rotated with mechanical patience, their weapons tracking distant distortions that flickered like dying stars. The pylon sang. It was not a sound meant for human ears, but every Cadian felt it, an almost imperceptible vibration beneath the boots, within the bones, inside the marrow of thought itself. Ancient construct of impossible origin, they stood in vast geometric arrays across the planet-scarred plains. Their purpose was singular, their endurance relentless. To hold back the Eye, above the world, the Eye of Terror churned in slow, malignant majesty. Its colors were wrong. Purples that bled into green flame, lightning that split open nothingness, tides of unreality folding into themselves. It did not advance in any conventional sense. It pressed. It tested. It whispered across dimensions. And Cadia answered with silence. In the fortress city of Caspatox, Lord Castellan Tyrox stood before a hololithic projection of the Gate. Tactical runes shimmered in crimson and gold, marking patrol routes, fleet positions, reinforcement vectors. Each symbol represented thousands of lives. Each shift in formation was calculated to the second. Warp pressure increasing along Vector Sigma. An officer reported calmly, "Minor surges only. The pylons are compensating." "For now," Tyrock replied. He had served on Cadia for 50 years. He had watched the Eye flare and recede more times than he could count. He had repelled black crusades that would have shattered lesser systems. He had buried comrades beneath stone etched with regimental pride. But this felt different. The readings were subtle. No grand invasion, no armada of heretic warships yet clawing toward real space. Instead, there was a pattern, a rhythm beneath the chaos. The Eye's tides no longer surged randomly. They gathered in measured pulses, like a heartbeat learning to synchronize. Far beyond the Gate, something was aligning. Across the plains of Cascraft, armored columns conducted night maneuvers under the glow of aurora-like warp distortion. Lemon rust battle tanks rolled in disciplined wedges, their engines growling low. Infantry squads advanced between them in perfect intervals, last gun steady, boots striking dust in precise cadence. To outsiders, it might have seemed excessive. There was no immediate enemy on the horizon, but Cadians did not train for the enemy they saw. They trained for the one that would arrive without warning. Commissar Halbrecht observed from a ridge, greatcoat snapping in the cold wind. Beside him, a young trooper, barely 16 Terran standard, kept her gaze fixed forward, jaw set with stubborn resolve. You understand what stands beyond that light? Halbrecht asked quietly, nodding toward the writhing sky. Yes, sir, she replied. What stands beyond it? Everything that hates us. He allowed himself the faintest nod. And what do we do about that? We hold. It was never a question. In orbit, Admiral Vortigern paced the command deck of the battleship Indomitable Resolve. All spec screens flickered with disturbances along the Cadian Gate. Each anomaly was catalogued, cross-referenced, analyzed by fleets of servitors and human strategists alike. Long-range augers detect mass displacement within the eye, a tech priest intoned, mechadendrites twitching. No translation signatures confirmed. Probability of organized incursion rising. By how much? Vortigern asked. Incrementally. Consistently. He exhaled slowly. The eye did not behave incrementally. For 10,000 years it had erupted in cataclysmic fury or simmered in malevolent quiet. This steady build suggested design, intention, patience beyond mortal comprehension. On the surface, the pylons intensified their glow. Across entire continents, their black stone surfaces shimmered with blue-white light. Warp lightning that might have lashed downward instead diffused harmlessly into invisible barriers. Psychic murmurs that would have driven populations mad were reduced to faint headaches among sanctioned psychers. In the fortress monastery at the heart of Casshone, sanctioned astropaths knelt in concentric circles. Their minds reached outward in cautious threads, probing the immaterium. They recoiled almost instantly. It watches, one whispered. It measures, another added. The presiding choir master tightened his grip on his staff. Then we shall measure in return. But even he knew the truth. Humanity could not truly measure the eye. It could only endure it. Deep beneath the surface, within vaults few Cadians had ever seen, Mechanicus adepts monitored the core harmonic frequencies of the pylons. Data streams cascaded across rune-etched displays. For millennia, the pylons had operated within stable variants. Now, micro-deviations emerged, insignificant alone, concerning together. Resonance drift at 0.003%, Amagos reported, adjusting counterphase emitters. Compensate, came the mechanical reply from the overseeing Archmagos. Failure is not an acceptable outcome. Failure on Cadia never was. Hours passed, then days. The eye's activity did not spike into open war. Instead, the distortions grew smoother, less chaotic, like a storm whose winds had begun to spiral with deliberate symmetry. Lord Castellan Tyrock stood once more before the hololith. New data scrolled across its surface. Unidentified energy convergence beyond standard warp fluctuation, an officer said, triangulated along multiple vectors deep within the eye. Show me, Tyrock ordered. The projection shifted. Lines intersected in a region long considered impenetrable to real space observation. A nexus, not an invasion fleet. Not yet. A gathering point. He felt a chill despite the fortress climate control. Alert the High Command. Increase readiness to Condition Veritas. Around him, officers stiffened. Condition Veritas had not been declared in living memory. Across Cadia, alarms did not blare. Sirens did not scream. Instead, subtle signals transmitted through encrypted Vox channels. Units adjusted patrol rotations. Orbital batteries recalibrated firing solutions. Supply depots unlocked sealed reserves. The planet did not panic. It prepared. That night, the sky above Cadia shifted. For a single breath of time, the eye's colors aligned into a vast, unblinking iris staring directly at the gate. Warp lightning arced outward in symmetrical spokes before dissolving against the pylon field. Every soldier on the walls saw it. Every officer in orbit recorded it. And every psyker felt an emotion ripple across the immaterium like a tremor through still water. Anticipation. The image faded, returning to its usual madness. But the message was clear. This was not a random tide of chaos. This was focus. On the walls of Caspatox, the young trooper Halbrecht had tightened her grip on her last gun. "Sir," she murmured, eyes fixed on the distant glow. "Is it coming?" The commissar did not look away from the horizon. "It has always been coming." He rested a gloved hand on the hilt of his bolt pistol. "But now," he added softly, "it believes it is ready." Across the plains, the pylons burned brighter. In orbit, fleets shifted into optimal engagement formation. Within the eye, something vast and terrible completed another unseen step in its design. Far beyond the gate, forces aligned in shadowed unity. And upon Cadia, unyielding, unbowed, the line hardened. The silence did not break. It deepened, and the storm learned to breathe. The storm did not arrive with fire. It arrived with order. Across the Eye of Terror, the turbulence that had defined 10,000 years of madness began to settle into dreadful symmetry. Warp eddies no longer collided at random. They curved inward. Streams of empiric lightning converged toward distant focal points. What had once been a realm of anarchic fury now displayed something far more dangerous. Coordination. On Cadia, the change was felt before it was fully understood. Astropaths awoke from fractured dreams with identical impressions, vast shapes drifting through unreality, not as scattered predators but as a fleet moving with singular intent. The images burned behind their eyes, iron silhouettes against burning nebulae, sigils the size of continents igniting in the warp dark. In the command bastion of Caspatox, Lord Castellan Tyrox studied a tactical projection layered with new anomalies. "Translation signatures?" he asked. "None confirmed," replied the senior Auspex officer. "But gravitational shear within the eye suggests mass accumulation on a scale consistent with capital-class vessels, possibly hundreds." Tyrox's expression did not change. "Black Crusade," another officer ventured. "No," Tyrox said quietly. "Not yet." Black Crusades had been blunt instruments, vast invasions hurled against the gate in waves of fury. This was something colder. The eye was not boiling over. It was building pressure behind reinforced walls. In orbit, Admiral Vortigern watched his deep-range augers struggle to pierce the veil. The indomitable resolve adjusted its position by fractional degrees, aligning broadside batteries toward the gate. Around it, cruisers and escorts shifted into layered defensive screens. "Deploy additional probe servitors," Vortigern ordered. "Even if they burn out, I want data." "Yes, Admiral." The probes would likely be devoured by the warp's tides, but even fragments of telemetry could reveal patterns, and patterns meant prediction. Below, along the pylon field of Cascraft, Mechanicus adepts worked without pause. The monoliths glowed brighter each hour, their energy harmonics tightening like drawn bowstrings. Resonance stabilization holding at 99.9%. Amagos reported. "Maintain output." The Archmagos intoned. "Prepare contingency amplification." Amplification risks structural fatigue. Noted. Execute. The pylons had endured millennia of assault, yet even they were not invulnerable. Their ancient creators, long vanished, had never intended them to withstand a coordinated surge of this magnitude. Across the fortress world, regiments rotated into forward bastions. Artillery crews recalibrated Earthshaker cannons. Hydra flak batteries tracked phantom targets through distorted skies. Commissar Halbrecht walked the parapets at dawn, boots striking stone in measured rhythm. The young trooper marched beside him again, her uniform now bearing the dust of endless drills. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked. "Yes," Halbrecht answered. "It's different." He nodded once. "The enemy is thinking." They halted at a vantage point overlooking the plains. In the distance, the pylons shimmered like pillars of frozen lightning. "When chaos rages," Halbrecht continued, "it can be met with discipline. When it schemes," he let the sentence fade. The trooper swallowed. "Then we hold harder." A faint smile touched the commissar's scarred face. "Exactly." Within the eye, the convergence accelerated. War bands that had feuded for centuries ceased their petty conflicts. Traitor fleets altered course in unison. Even the demon tides flowed along structured corridors, carving pathways through the immaterium's chaos. At the heart of it all, unseen and distant, a presence observed. Not a god in the traditional sense. Not a mere warlord. A will. It did not rage. It calculated. Back on Cadia, seismic sensors detected tremors rippling beneath the crust, minor at first, then increasing in frequency. Pylon feedback. Tyrock asked as reports flooded in. Negative, replied the Mechanicus liaison, originating from subcrustal strata, possibly sympathetic resonance induced by warp pressure. Meaning, Tyrock pressed, the storm is pushing harder than before. He turned back to the hololith. The convergence markers within the eye had tightened further. What had been a diffuse gathering now resembled a constellation, points of immense power aligned in geometric precision. Condition Veritas remains in effect, Tyrock said. Escalate to condition Aegis. Around him, officers exchanged glances. Condition Aegis meant full planetary defense readiness. No leave, no deviation from combat status. Every soldier on the line. Across the world, klaxons finally sounded, not in panic, but in declaration. This was it. In orbit, Admiral Vortigern received confirmation. All vessels assume bastion formation. Anchored to Cadian Prime. No ship breaks line without direct authorization. Acknowledgements echoed across the fleet. The Cadian Gate would become a wall of steel and plasma. As the day waned, the sky darkened unnaturally. The eye's roiling colors compressed into deeper hues, as though light itself feared to stray too far from the pylon's protective field. Then, without warning, the first true signal came. A spear of concentrated warp energy lashed outward from the eye, not random lightning, but a focused beam aimed directly at the pylon network near Cass Craft. The impact shook continents. Pylons flared blinding white. Energy cascaded across their surfaces in cascading arcs. For a heartbeat, the barrier flickered. Alarm screamed through command centers. Structural integrity holding at 94%, a Mago shouted. Feedback spike contained. On the plains, soldiers were thrown from their feet as shockwaves rippled through the ground. Tanks rocked on their treads. Dust clouds surged skyward. But the pylons did not fall. The beam dissipated against the lattice of ancient stone. A test. Tyrock steadied himself against the hololith console. They are probing for weakness. Shall we return fire? An officer asked. He hesitated only a moment. Negative. We do not reveal our full strength yet. In orbit, weapons officers trembled at their stations, fingers hovering over firing runes. The fleet held discipline. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then the eye responded again, not with another spear, but with motion. Across its vast circumference, silhouettes emerged. At first they were shadows against brighter warp storms. Then they sharpened into forms unmistakable even at impossible distance. Warships. Hundreds. Their prows faced outward. Toward Cadia. Admiral Vortigern's voice cut through fleet vox. All ships, battle stations. Targeting solutions prioritized. We engage on translation. On the surface, Commissar Halbrecht drew his bow pistol and looked to the young trooper. This is the moment history remembers, he said. She raised her last gun, fear replaced by iron resolve. Cadia stands. The pylons blazed brighter than ever before, their harmonics climbing into frequencies that made the air itself tremble. Within the eye, the aligned constellation ignited. Reality bent. Space screamed. And one by one, the first vessels of the gathering constellation began to translate toward the gate. Not in scattered fury, but in perfect formation. The storm had finished learning. Now it would strike. The first translation tore reality open like a blade through flesh. Above Cadia, space fractured into a wound of impossible geometry. Light bent inward. Vox channels shrieked with static. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the void itself seemed to recoil. Then the warship emerged. It was vast, its hull jagged like a serrated crown, cathedral spires fused with iron battlements, its flanks scarred by 10,000 years of war. Runes burned along its surface in baleful crimson, each symbol pulsing in time with a warp storm behind it. More tears followed. One became 3. 3 became a dozen. Within seconds, the Cadian Gate blazed with translation signatures as an armada forced its way into real space in flawless alignment. Enemy fleet confirmed. Admiral Vortigern's voice thundered across the command decks. All batteries, fire. The void erupted. Macro cannons discharged in synchronized fury, recoils shuddering through the hulls of loyalist battleships. Lances speared outward in lines of coherent light, striking the lead traitor vessel before its shields fully stabilized. The first impact carved molten scars across its armor. It did not slow. Return fire answered immediately, blackened plasma lances that cut through escort frigates, detonations blooming like malignant stars. One Imperial cruiser vanished in a blossom of expanding debris, its reactor core collapsing in on itself before igniting. The Void War had begun. On the surface, every soldier felt the tremor as distant detonations rippled through orbit. The sky shimmered with streaks of light, falling wreckage, burning fragments scattering across the upper atmosphere. Maintain formation. Commanders bark across the plains. The pylons surged brighter, reacting to the strain of mass translations. Their harmonic lattice flared in defensive brilliance, stabilizing reality against the expanding breach. In Cas Partox, Lord Castellan Tyrock watched the hololith flood with red icons. Identify the flagship, he ordered. Auspex returned sharpened, isolating a vessel larger than the rest, its prow shaped like a horned beast, flanked by escort squadrons in arrowhead formation. "That's the spear," Tyrock murmured. "Break it, and the formation falters." "Orbital assets engaging," came the reply. Above, the indomitable resolve pivoted with ponderous grace. Admiral Vortigern stood rigid as firing solutions converged. Concentrate lance batteries on the lead vessel. All ships synchronize. A chorus of confirmations echoed. The void flashed white. 3 battleships unleashed focused lance strikes that converge upon the traitor flagship shields. Energy bearers flared violently, collapsing under sustained assault. The next volley punched through exposed armor, detonating secondary munitions along its dorsal spine. For a heartbeat, it seemed the spear might shatter. Then the flagship answered. A beam of abyssal darkness lanced outward, not light, but absence. It struck an Imperial battleship amidships. The vessel convulsed, its hull imploding as if crushed by an invisible fist. Within seconds, it folded inward and vanished into a sphere of collapsing gravity. "By the throne," someone whispered. Admiral Vortigern did not flinch. "Close ranks. Maintain bastion formation." The traitor fleet advanced as one, weapons firing in disciplined cadence. They did not scatter. They did not rage. They executed. Behind the engaged fleet, warp energies spiraled inward, forming a secondary vortex. Smaller vessels began translating. Transports, assault carriers, ships designed not for void supremacy but planetary invasion. Tyrock saw it instantly. They intend a dual assault. Fleet engagement to pin us. Ground incursion to fracture the pylons. "Authorized surface interdiction," an officer asked. "Negative. The pylons must hold first." Across the pylon fields, tremors intensified. Warp pressure pressed against the harmonic barrier like a tidal wave against glass. Then the sky split. A spear of empiric fire slammed into a pylon near Cascraft, far stronger than the earlier probe. The monolith blazed, cracked spiderwebbing along its surface as energy bled into the surrounding lattice. "Integrity dropping," a Magos cried. 8 to 9%, 8 to 5. "Reinforce adjacent nodes," the Archmagos commanded. Energy rerouted, stabilizing the failing structure. The cracks sealed, though faint scars remained etched in black stone. On the plains, armored regiments repositioned instinctively, forming concentric defensive rings around critical pylon clusters. Earthshaker cannons angled skyward, prepared to target descending craft. The invasion came seconds later. From the belly of traitor carriers, drop pods ignited, hundreds of them. They streaked through atmosphere like meteors, contrails burning red against the ashen sky. "Contact imminent," Vox channels roared. Hydra batteries opened fire, flak bursts peppering the heavens. Several pods exploded mid-descent, scattering debris across the plains. But many more endured, slamming into Cadian soil with bone-rattling force. Ramps detonated outward. KO Space Marines emerged, towering figures in corrupted ceramite, banners of flayed skin trailing behind them. Their bolters roared immediately, explosive shells tearing into forward Cadian lines. "Hold," officers shouted. Last gun volleys answered in disciplined sheets of red light. Tanks advanced, battle cannons thundering as they targeted clusters of advancing traitors. The ground war had begun. Commissar Halbrecht raised his bolt pistol and fired, detonating a charging heretic in a spray of shrapnel. The young trooper fired beside him, her aim steady despite the carnage unfolding below. Across the plains, the clash intensified. Chains' words screamed. Artillery thundered. Smoke and ash turned daylight into twilight. Yet even amid the fury, the pylon continued to burn, silent guardians anchoring reality. In orbit, Admiral Vortigern saw the second wave forming behind the initial fleet. "They mean to overwhelm us by attrition," he muttered. "Orders, Admiral." He straightened. "Signal all reserves. This is no longer containment." He keyed the fleet-wide vox himself. "This is Admiral Vortigern. Cadia stands at the gate of oblivion. We will not yield a single meter of void. Anchor, fire, break their spear." The void answered in flame. On the surface, Tyrock watches new enemy signatures appeared across the hololith. Multiple breach attempts along the pylon perimeter, and aid reported. "Then we counterattack," Tyrock said. He activated the planetary vox. "All regiments, advance under pylon cover. Drive them back from the lattice. This world does not bend." Outside, as Chaos forces surged toward the ancient monoliths, the pylon flared with renewed brilliance, their harmonics climbing into frequencies that made the air vibrate like a struck bell. Above, fleets clashed in burning arcs of destruction. Below, soldiers fought in disciplined defiance. Between them, the gate blazed. The storm had struck, and Cadia had answered with fire. The battle did not descend into chaos. It refined itself. Across the plains of Cascraft, the initial shock of impact gave way to calculated brutality. Cadian artillery found its rhythm, earth-shaker rounds landing with mechanical precision among advancing heretic formations. Each detonation lifted armored giants into the air before scattering them in broken arcs of ceramite and fire. But still they came. The Chaos Space Marines advanced in disciplined wedges, their corrupted standards whipping through smoke-choked winds. Behind them rolled demon engines, metal fused with flesh, cannons roaring with warp-infused ammunition that left craters boiling with unnatural flame. "Target the engines," commanders barked. Lemon Rust squadrons pivoted, battle cannons thundering. One demon engine vanished in a bloom of incandescent ruin. Another staggered, half its frame torn away, yet continued forward, shrieking through vox static that clawed at the minds of nearby infantry. Commissar Halbrecht reloaded without looking down. "Second line, forward," he commanded. Fresh Cadian units moved with drilled efficiency, stepping into gaps left by the fallen. There was no hesitation, no screaming retreat. Every meter lost was measured. Every meter reclaimed was earned in blood. Beside him, the young trooper fired in controlled bursts, her jaw clenched against a concussion of artillery. "They are pushing toward the pylons," she shouted over the din. Halbrecht followed her gaze. Through the smoke, he saw it. 3 spears of traitor elites angling not for the casters, not for supply lines, but directly toward the nearest monolith cluster. "They understand," he muttered. "They know what matters." Above, in orbit, Admiral Vortigern faced the same realization. The traitor fleet had ceased broad engagement. Instead, select vessels broke formation in precise intervals, their weaponry targeting specific segments of the pylon lattice visible from space. They were not attempting planetary annihilation. They were seeking disruption. "Redirect defensive fire to their support cruisers," Vortigern ordered. "Deny them orbital synergy." The indomitable resolve unleashed another coordinated launch strike, shearing through a corrupted cruiser attempting to align bombardment vectors with ground forces. The vessel split apart, its reactor detonation briefly outshining nearby stars. Yet even as it died, 2 more slid into its place. The spear was not a single blade. It was a formation of many edges. On the surface, the ground shuddered again. A tremor stronger than any before rippled outward from beneath the pylon network. Dust cascaded from parapets. Vox arrays flickered. In the Mechanicus vaults, warning runes pulsed crimson. Subcrustal resonance spike. Amagos reported. Warp harmonics exceeding projected thresholds. The Archmagos mechadendrites twitched in rapid calculation. The enemy is synchronizing orbital strikes with ground proximity to induce lattice instability. Solution: counter-resonance amplification risks cascade failure. Implement controlled amplification. The Archmagos intoned. We hold the frequency. Above the planes, the pylons flared to blinding brilliance. Energy arced between them in visible streams, forming a web of crackling light that rippled outward in expanding rings. The nearest Chaos spear faltered as a wave passed through them. Warp-imbued armor flickered. Demonic sigils dimmed. Cadian artillery seized the moment. Fire for effect. Shells rained down in disciplined fury, tearing apart exposed formations. For a brief, glorious span of seconds, the advance stalled. But the eye answered. The sky darkened unnaturally as a column of warp energy descended. Not a random strike, but a sustained beam aimed at the heart of the pylon cluster under siege. It struck. The impact was cataclysmic. One monolith fractured. A crack split from its apex to its base, spilling arcs of uncontrolled energy into the air. The harmonic web destabilized, flickering across adjacent pylons. In cast partox, Tyrok gripped the edge of the hololith table. Report. Primary pylon integrity at 62% and falling, came the reply. On the plains, soldiers staggered as a wave of psychic pressure rolled outward. For an instant, the air shimmered with impossible colors. Shadows moved against the direction of light. Then reality thinned. From the fracture point, shapes began to claw their way into being, diamonds coalescing from raw warp leakage, their forms half solid, half smoke. The line wavered. Halbrecht raised his bolt pistol and fired into the emerging tide. Close ranks, he roared. No step back. The young trooper's last gun burned bright as she targeted a demon lunging toward the pylon's base. It dissolved under sustained fire, but two more replaced it. Tanks pivoted, heavy bolters chattering. Infantry formed concentric firing circles around the damaged monolith. Above, Admiral Vortigern saw the spike in warp output. They fractured a node, he said grimly. Recommend targeted orbital strike on compromised pylon to prevent full breach, an officer suggested. Vortigern's jaw tightened. Destroying the pylon would seal the breach, but at the cost of weakening the entire network. He hesitated only a heartbeat. Negative. We reinforce. He opened a direct channel to Tyrok. They are creating a fault line, he said. I see it, Tyrok replied. We hold that ground or the lattice collapses. On the surface, Mechanicus adept scrambled toward the fractured monolith, servo arms extended, chanting Benheric litanies as they attempted emergency stabilization. The Archmagos activated the counter-resonance array. Energy surged upward from subterranean generators, channeling into the damaged pylon. The crack glowed white-hot as harmonics relined. For a moment, the warp breach widened. Diamonds poured forth in greater numbers, shrieking in triumph. Then the lattice snapped back into alignment. The crack sealed. The breach imploded. Every demon within the radius disintegrated in a cascade of fading embers. Silence fell for a single breath across the battlefield. Then the artillery resumed. The Chaos spearheads, though blooded, began repositioning, adapting to the failed breach. Their commanders were not reckless. They recalculated even as they advanced. In orbit, the traitor flagship altered course, its prow angling slightly off the original vector. Tyrok saw the shift. They are not abandoning the assault, he murmured. They are adjusting the angle of attack. A new set of convergence markers lit the hololith, further along the pylon network. A second fracture line. On the plains, Halbrecht lowered his pistol momentarily, smoke curling from its barrel. They lone, the young trooper whispered. Yes, he said grimly. He looked toward the next cluster of pylons, where distant flashes signaled renewed enemy movement. This is not a single breach attempt, he continued. It is a campaign of erosion. Above them, the eye churned, but now its movements mirrored the battlefield below, spiraling in patterns that echoed fleet maneuvers and ground offensives alike. The storm was no longer merely striking. It was adapting. And across Cadia, from orbit to bedrock, the fracture lines began to multiply. The second fracture did not announce itself with a beam. It began as a tremor too subtle for untrained senses. Across the northern pylon fields near Cas Myrak, seismic monitors registered a harmonic distortion, barely measurable, buried beneath the thunder of artillery and the constant pulse of the lattice. But to the Mechanicus adept attuned to the rhythm of the pylons, it was unmistakable. A counter-frequency. They are not striking this time, a Magos whispered through crackling vox. They are singing. Beneath the battlefield, something in the warp had begun to resonate in deliberate opposition to the pylon's stabilizing tone. It was not brute force. It was interference. On the plains, Cadian regiments redeployed toward the new convergence point. Columns of armor cut through drifting ash, engines roaring as they formed layered defensive arcs around the threatened monoliths. Lord Castellan Tyrock watched the hololithic display update in real time. The traitor fleet had shifted again in orbit, a cluster of cruisers breaking from the main engagement to a line above Casamirak. They are triangulating, Tyrock said quietly. Orbital vectors and ground incursions synchronize a harmonic sabotage. Orders, his aide asked. Dispatch the 101st Armored. Reinforce the northern lattice. And signal Admiral Vortigern, deny them alignment. In orbit, the void war raged without pause. Wreckage fields drifted like metallic graveyards between the battling fleets. Fires burned where ships had ruptured, their corpses spinning silently against the stars. Admiral Vortigern received Tyrock's transmission and did not hesitate. Helm, bring us about 15 degrees starboard. Intercept those cruisers. The indomitable Resolve pivoted, its engines flaring. Escort frigates followed, forming a shield screen as they accelerated toward the traitor cluster attempting orbital synchronization. Fire on my mark, Vortigern commanded. Below, the second fracture manifested. The pylons near Casamirak flickered, not from direct impact, but from harmonic destabilization. Their glow dimmed by fractions, then flared erratically. Energy arcs between them wavered like a disrupted signal. And from the ground itself, the enemy emerged. Not drop pods this time. Tunneling charges detonated beneath Cadian lines, blasting open trenches as corrupted assault forces surged upward from concealed subterranean insertions. Chaos Terminators, clad in Baroque armor etched with demonic faces, rose from the smoke like revenants. Contact rear positions, Vox operators screamed. The assault had bypassed the outer defenses entirely. Commissar Halbrecht, redeployed north with fresh companies, saw the breach unfold across the ridge ahead. They're inside the perimeter, the young trooper said, disbelief tightening her voice. Halbrecht's eyes hardened. Then the perimeter moves. He drew his chainsword, its teeth roaring to life. Counter-saw formation. Drive them back into the earth. Cadian infantry wheeled with drill precision, firing lines collapsing inward before expanding again to encircle the emerging threat. Tanks reversed and pivoted, their heavy bolters saturating the breach zones with disciplined fire. But the Terminators advanced through it all, bolters booming, power fists crushing armored hulls as though they were parchment. At the heart of the northern pylon cluster, the harmonic distortion intensified. Mechanicus Adept struggled to recalibrate resonance emitters as the opposing frequency from the warp grew stronger. The pylon song faltered, just slightly, but enough. The air shimmered. Reality thinned. Small tears appeared between the monoliths, flickering like wounds trying to reopen. Resonance dropping to 81%, a Mago shouted. Counterphase failing. In orbit, Vortigern's fleet reached intercept range. Mark! Lance batteries discharge in blinding unity, striking the leading traitor cruiser attempting alignment above Casamirak. Its shields collapsed under the concentrated barrage. A second volley tore through its hull, splitting the vessel in a cascade of detonations. Yet even as it died, another cruiser slid into it precise. They anticipated losses, Vortigern muttered. Maintain pressure. Back on the surface, the ground war devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Halbrecht's chainsword bit into corrupted ceramite, sparks cascading as he forced a Terminator back step by step. The young trooper fired into a cluster of cultist reinforcements attempting to flood the breach, her last gun barrel glowing from sustained discharge. "Commissar!" she shouted. He turned in time to see a Terminator raise its combi bolter toward the damaged pylon behind them. Without hesitation, Halbrecht threw himself forward, tackling the trooper aside as explosive rounds detonated against the monolith's surface. The pylon cracked. Not a full fracture, but a visible line of weakness etched across its obsidian face. The harmonic web spasmed violently. Across the battlefield, soldiers staggered as a psychic shockwave rippled outward. For a split second, the eye above flared brighter, as if sensing opportunity. In the Mechanicus vaults, the Archmagos made a decision. Initiate harmonic surge protocol. Ouch, Magos, a subordinate protested. The strain could cascade across the entire lattice. Execute. Deep beneath Cadia's crust, dormant generators ignited. Energy surged upward through ancient conduits, flooding the northern pylon cluster with amplified power. On the plains, the monoliths blazed like newborn stars. The crack across the damaged pylon glowed white-hot, then began to seal. Warped tiers between the pylons imploded in rapid succession, sucking in half-formed demonic shapes before collapsing into nothingness. The counter-frequency shattered. A shockwave erupted outward, not of warp, but of stabilized reality. Chaos terminators nearest the pylons faltered, their armor flickering as the empiric interference sustaining them wavered. Now! Halbrecht roared. Cadian forces surged forward with renewed fury. Battle cannons fired at point-blank range. Plasma guns burned through thick armor. The Terminators fell one by one beneath relentless discipline. In orbit, Vortigern's intercept squadron destroyed a second cruiser and forced a remainder to disengage from optimal alignment. The northern fracture line stabilized, but the cost was visible. Across the hololith in Cas Partox, Tyrock watched as energy reserves within the pylon network dipped measurably. "How long can we sustain harmonic surges of that magnitude?" he asked. The Mechanicus liaison hesitated. "Finite duration, Lord Castellan." "Define finite." "Unknown." Tyrock exhaled slowly. They had repelled the second fracture. But the pattern was clear now. The enemy was not seeking a single catastrophic breach. They were mapping the lattice, testing every angle, learning its tolerances. On the northern plains, smoke drifted over fields littered with wreckage and fallen warriors. The young trooper leaned against her last gun, breathing hard. "We stopped them," she said. "For now," Halbrecht replied. He looked skyward, where fleet battle continued in burning arcs. "This is not a storm that exhausts itself," he said quietly. "It is one that studies." Above Cadia, the eye churned once more, not in fury, but in measured calculation. The braking pattern had failed, but it had revealed the fault lines. And somewhere within the storm's vast mind, new equations were already forming. The battlefield did not fall silent after the northern surge. It tightened. Across Cadia, every commander understood the same truth. The enemy had shifted from assault to analysis. Each strike, each breach attempt, had not been random aggression. It had been data collection written in fire. Lord Castellan Tyrock stood before a hololithic projection now webbed with layered schematics of the pylon lattice. Faint markers highlighted stress tolerances, resonance dips, surge thresholds. The northern cluster glowed amber, stable, but weakened. "They know where we bend," Tyrock said. The Mechanicus liaison inclined his hooded head. "Affirmative." Harmonic surge protocol restored integrity, but energy reserves have diminished by 11% across the network. 11%, Tyrock repeated quietly. In orbit, Admiral Vortigern received similar assessments. Ammunition stocks had fallen below optimal engagement parameters. Several cruisers limped in degraded formation, their armor flayed open by lance strikes and warp-infused munitions. Yet the traitor fleet had not pressed a full breakthrough. They hovered just beyond decisive range, maintaining relentless but measured pressure. "They're conserving strength," Vortigern observed. "Awaiting reinforcement," an officer suggested. "Or timing." Below, on the scarred plains of Casamyrek, Cadian regiments fortified the recently stabilized pylon cluster. Combat engineers raised prefabricated bastions around the monolith bases. Tank traps and minefields spread outward in expanding rings. Commissar Halbrecht walked through the aftermath of the northern breach, boots crunching over shattered ceramite and cooling shell casings. Medici teams moved among the fallen with disciplined efficiency. The young trooper stood beside a damaged Chimera transport, watching the sky where distant fleet fire still flickered like dying lightning. "They could have broken through," she said softly. Halbrecht did not deny it. "Yes." "Why didn't they?" He considered the question. "Because breaking through is not their only objective." He gestured toward the pylons, their black surfaces still glowing faintly from the earlier surge. "They want to unmake the lock, not shatter the door." As if summoned by his words, the eye above shifted again. Not violently, subtly. Its swirling storms thinned along a narrow corridor directly opposite the Cadian Gate. The distortion resembled a channel carved through chaos, an intentional clearing. In Cas Partox, Auspex arrays flared with new readings. Localized warp thinning along vector prime, an officer reported. Energy density decreasing in a linear pattern. Tyrok's eyes narrowed. They are creating a stable corridor. For reinforcements, the aide asked. No, Tyrok replied grimly. For something heavier. In orbit, Vortigern saw it too. The traitor fleet adjusted formation, widening the corridor with calculated volleys that suppress Imperial ships attempting to close the gap. Admiral, the tactical officer said, voice tight, long-range Auspex detecting mass signature beyond current fleet tonnage. Scale, extreme. How extreme? Equivalent to a capital-class vessel multiplied several times over. A silence settled across the command deck. A super-heavy asset, Vortigern concluded. Or worse. On the surface, the pylons began to hum at a deeper frequency. Their harmonic field reacted instinctively to the thinning corridor, reinforcing the lattice along the gate's axis. In the Mechanicus vaults, runes flashed amber. The enemy attempts macro-stabilization of the warp corridor, Amagos reported. If they succeed, translation mass could exceed previous Black Crusade projections. The Archmagos process streams of data at inhuman speed. Probability of pylon overload. Rising. Tyrok received the projection seconds later. If the incoming mass translated fully through the corridor, the lattice would absorb strain beyond any prior event. Harmonic surges might compensate, but at catastrophic energy cost. Can we disrupt the corridor preemptively? Tyrok asked. Only by destabilizing the lattice ourselves, the liaison replied, which would grant the eye uncontrolled expansion. Tyrok's jaw tightened. In orbit, Vortigern faced the same calculus. If that mass translates intact, an officer said, our current formation cannot contain it. Then we weaken it before it arrives, Vortigern said. He opened a fleet-wide channel. All vessels concentrate fire along the forming corridor. Saturation pattern gamma. Deny stabilization. The void erupted once more as Imperial ships unleashed coordinated barrages into the thinning warp channel. Lances and macro shells tore into the distortion, briefly disrupting its cohesion. But the traitor fleet responded instantly, interposing themselves as living shields. Cruisers absorbed impacts meant for the corridor, detonating in sacrificial brilliance. They are trading ships for stability, Vortigern realized. Below, Halbrecht felt the ground tremble, not from artillery, but from harmonic escalation. The pylons flared brighter as they compensated for the corridor's formation. The young trooper looked toward the gate, where the sky now appeared stretched thin. Commissar, what is coming? He did not look away. Something they believe will end this. Across Cadia, Vox networks crackled with readiness orders. Reserve regiments mobilized. Titans in distant bastions stirred from standby, their massive forms awakening to war. In the depths of the eye, the corridor stabilized fully. Then the shadow appeared. It was not a ship in conventional sense. It was a silhouette vast enough to eclipse entire segments of the storm behind it, an arc of iron and abyssal architecture, its hull layered with battlements and spiked towers that dwarfed lesser warships. As it advanced, the warp corridor widened to accommodate its impossible mass. Translation imminent, Vortigern whispered. The pylons screamed. Their harmonic song rose into audible vibration, a planetary chorus pushing back against the corridor's strain. Energy arced between monoliths in visible strands of white fire. In the Mechanicus vaults, alarms cascaded. Lattice stress at critical thresholds. Engage full harmonic surge, Amagos asked. The Archmagos hesitated a fraction. If we surge at maximum, energy reserves may not recover. If we do not, another replied, the corridor may breach containment. On the plains, Halbrecht planted his boots as the air thickened with psychic pressure. Around him, soldiers steadied themselves, eyes locked on the widening tear in the sky. The young trooper swallowed but did not lower her weapon. Cadia stands, she whispered. In Cas Partox, Tyrok made his choice. Authorized full harmonic surge across the primary axis. The command transmitted instantly. Deep beneath the crust, every generator roared to life. Power surged upward in a torrent of ancient design, flooding the pylon network. The monoliths ignited in blinding unity. A beam of pure, stabilized reality lanced outward from the gate itself, striking the warp corridor head-on. The sky detonated in light. The incoming shadow faltered mid-translation, its silhouette flickering between real space and warp. Shockwaves rippled outward, tearing apart smaller escort vessels caught too close. In orbit, Vortigern seized a moment. All ships, fire everything. The Imperial fleet unleashed its full arsenal into the destabilized corridor. Lances, torpedoes, macro shells, an avalanche of destruction aimed at a half-formed titan forcing its way through. The corridor buckled. The shadow recoiled. With a roar that shook both realms, the massive vessel was hurled backward into the eye, its translation aborted in catastrophic implosion. The warp corridor collapsed. Silence followed. On the surface, the pylons dimmed, still standing, but drained. Across the network, energy reserves plummeted into dangerous lows. Tyrok stared at the hololith. "We stopped it," an officer breathed. "For now," Tyrok replied. In orbit, the traitor fleet began to withdraw slightly, reforming beyond immediate engagement range. Not routed. Reassessing. On the plains, Halbrecht lowered his chainsword, smoke curling from its teeth. The young trooper exhaled slowly. "We held," she said. "Yes," Halbrecht answered. He looked up at the eye, which churned once more, not in blind fury, but in cold patience. "We held," he repeated, but across Cadia, from orbit to bedrock, the cost of that surge was felt in every flicker of the pylon's fading light. The line remained unbroken, yet for the first time since the war began, it had trembled.